Is this the first time that you've ever seen Aurora Borealis crush mankind? A flashlight's underneath my chin, a pretty winter night, your hand in mine. 'Cause I always mess it up, and I get it if you run. I just had to share with someone. Alright, yeah. Oh, the music is probably like really quiet. One second. There we go. Bro Slade, thank you. Hi, chat. Question mark live. Thank you for the follow. How you doing? Wait, are you Mark from the Origins, sir? Bro's voices. Thank you. Yes, LMAO. Well, welcome. Thank you for following. Today we are going to be reading the next chapter of The Stars and Their Children by Bones and the Bees. If you don't know who that is, if you've ever heard of the like one of Wilbur's fanfic characters, Siren, Bones and the Bees wrote that story. I actually read it on stream a few months back. Hold on, sorry. I just got a interesting notification. And I've been reading Bones and the Bees stuff for a while. I read Tom Unit's Clinic for Supervillains. That's the one with Siren in it. Such a goated author for real? You get me. It's Tom Unit's Clinic for Supervillains, Under the Brine, Nocturnal Animals, and now this. I love reading like fan fiction on stream, but I'm very selective about it because there are some things that kind of make me uncomfortable to read. And Bones and the Bees' stuff is just like perfect. And I did get permission from Bones and the Bees. It's totally fine that I've been reading her stuff. And I got that ages ago. I just thought I'd clear that up. But yeah, we're gonna be reading chapter 24 today. It is the latest update. The story's not finished yet. I think there's gonna be 28 chapters, it says. But yeah, this is as far as the story goes so far. So we need to wait a little bit for another update. But before we get into that, if you enjoy my stream and you want to see, you need a link to the Discord again? Okay, the invite link might have expired. Let me see. I need to update the Discord link in my link tree every week because the thing expires. But okay, sure, claim my offer. No, that's not what I want. Never mind. Yeah, invite invalid. I need to update the Discord invite. 1 second. I was gonna say, if you enjoy the stream, I have other socials that if you do !socials, it'll bring you to them, including my Discord server, but don't try and join this Discord server just yet. I need to update the invite link. One second. Boop, boop, boop. Boop, boop. There we go. Should be updated now. Twitch, no, Notif, you were literally in the waiting room. How did you not... How did you... Don't worry, I haven't started the chapter yet. There we go. That should have my updated Discord server link now if anyone wants to join the server and be updated on when I go live. Because I make updates on when I'm going to go live on Discord and on Twitter. But ignore the fact that I forgot to do that on Twitter today. That was just a... That was... Just wipe that from your memory. Yeah. So, let's get into the... Let's get into the reading, eh? Also, I know that hashtag internet celebrity. I know that it's probably like a bit of an eye strain having AO3 on dark mode, but this is legitimately better for my eyes than light mode, so I'm sorry. And at five subs, I will play Omori. So if you want to see me play Omori, you could subscribe. People shy. I'm a broke college student. I need money. No, I'm kidding. I don't want to sound too desperate. I feel like most people read fics at night. Anyways, true. That was literally me. Still is literally me. Funny thing is, this is one of the only times that I ever read is for these streams. Because I just I barely have the attention span to read it. Excuse me, to read anymore. Alright. Also, really? Yeah. I used to be a huge bookworm, and I don't know what happened. Probably burnout. Do I know natural readers? No. What? That's a thing? I'll have to look into that at some point. Also, for any new viewers, I use accents for the characters. It helps with my immersion. Sorry if it's cringe. But also not sorry. And I just splashed water on my nose. Oh, jeez, really? That's interesting. Let's see. Chapter 24. Truth is a bitter pill to swallow. So, if you missed... summary. The brothers have to deal with what they now know. It helps I have a great British... Okay, I wouldn't say it's great, but thank you. If you missed the previous chapters, Wilbur and Tommy got in a fight. Tommy called him a bastard, and that really hurt Wilbur, so in retaliation, he started only speaking to him, like, formally, and they got separate rooms, and they'd been avoiding each other like the plague. But in the previous chapter, Wilbur's starting to realize that maybe it is a good idea to join the Antarctic Empire, especially after he found out that he really did not deserve to be treated the way he did on Eldingvegger. And then he and Tommy made up because Wilbur thought that Tommy hated him now because he called him a bastard. Because, you know, Wilbur is technically, like, the bastard child. But Tommy said that he only, like, said that. He didn't actually mean it. And so they kind of made up. They still have things that they need to talk about, but they said they would do it in the morning because they were too tired. They went to go get water, and they found out that Wilbur was right the entire time about Rambu being a spy. Like, spying on them, trying to get information out of them, and reporting it back to Technoblade. And that's what the summary is talking about. The brothers have to deal with what they now know. Let's see. There's no trigger warnings, so we are good. Wilbur stumbled back into his room, blood roaring in his ears as he had to practically drag Tommy in behind him. His head was spinning. His eyes were burning. Rambu's voice kept echoing in his ears. I've been trying to befriend him since he got here like you told me to, Techno. Like he'd been told to. All of those awkward smiles and stuttered apologies. His quiet attempts at asking Wilbur how he was doing. The way his voice cracked when he admitted that he thought the two of them could be friends. It was a lie. Rambu never wanted to be his friend. At least, not of his own volition. He was only doing that because Techno had ordered him to. That wasn't even the worst part, though. You've literally been reporting to me about Theseus for months. The friendship Rambu had with both him and Tommy was never genuine. It was all a ploy to get information for Techno and Phil. There had always been something off about Rambu's behavior that put Wilbur's paranoia on edge, but as of late, he'd been trying to chalk it up to the fact that he was just socially awkward. He'd pushed down the uncertainty in his gut, having been told over and over again by everyone around him that he was wrong, that his suspicions had no ground to stand on. Tommy had told him that outright, that he was too paranoid for his own good, because Tommy was trusting. Fuck, he was so trusting, and Wilbur had always been worried that was going to be used against him. Shit. Tommy. Tommy? Wilbur whispered as soon as the door hissed shut behind them, turning to his little brother. Also, let me know if the music is too loud. It feels like it's too loud in my headphones, but that could just be me. Tommy was standing in front of the door, head bowed and arms folded over his chest. His shoulders were trembling, and Wilbur took a careful step closer to him. Also, let me check to make sure I have them right. Okay, yeah, I'm using the right microphone. Good, good, good. Tom? He tried again. Are you okay? A shudder ran through him. No, he croaked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. I'm not fucking okay. Wilbur took another step towards him. Tommy didn't look up, and flinched violently when he rested a hand on his shoulder. As he pulled his hand away, Tommy spoke again. So are you gonna say I told you so? He asked, eyes still fixed on the floor. Because you were right. This whole fucking time, you kept telling me that Rambu... that he couldn't... He cut himself off with a shaky breath. You were right, and I was wrong. Just lay it on me. Tell me I'm a fucking idiot. Despite the fact that he was hiding his face from Wilbur's view, He could tell that Tommy was on the verge of sobbing. If he wasn't so hollowed out from his breakdown that had happened only a few minutes before, Wilbur had a feeling he'd be in a similar state. "You're not an idiot," Wilbur whispered instead, reaching out again, and feeling relieved when Tommy didn't flinch away from the hand on his arm this time. "I didn't want to be right." Another shudder from Tommy. "But you were," he pointed out, his words so soft Wilbur struggled to hear them. Pressing his mouth into a thin line, Wilbur nodded. "I guess I was." And that seemed to break Tommy. A violent sob tore from his throat, and he launched himself at Wilbur, wrapping his arms around his shoulders and burying his face into his chest. His breaths came in stuttered gasps as he began to cry into Wilbur's shirt, and all Wilbur could do was wrap his arms around his back, tucking his little brother under his chin and holding him as tightly as he could to show him he was there. "He betrayed me!" Tommy sobbed, his voice muffled. I thought he was my friend, but he wasn't. He fucking wasn't." "I'm so sorry, Tommy. I told him so much," Tommy confessed, clutching the fabric of Wilbur's shirt like it was a lifeline. He told all of that to fucking Techno. I should have known. Techno always seemed to know when I was pissed because of you or something, and I didn't. I thought he was just good at reading me or something." "You see the best in people," Wilbur reminded him, trying to keep his tone as gentle as possible. "That's not a bad thing. I promise it's not." Tommy stifled another sob into Wilbur's shirt, the pure anguish in his cries tearing Wilbur's heart in two. It was so reminiscent of that first night after the invasion, when they were hidden in the crawl space and Tommy cried into his chest to muffle his voice. Wilbur had never wanted to hear Tommy cry like that again. That was one of the things he'd been most afraid of this entire time. Tommy being hurt again, and Wilbur not being able to do anything to help him. Tommy gasped for air, dissolving into even more tears before he could get the words out. Wilbur ran his hand up and down Tommy's back, trying to calm him down just like he'd done for Wilbur only a few minutes before. A beat passed, then another. The trembling slowly died down. Tommy lifted his head from Wilbur's shoulder, and he could see his little brother's eyes were bright red and swollen as could be. "I even told him about Tubbo," he admitted, tears spilling down his cheeks. Oh, that was cruel. For Rambu to know what Tommy had been through, how badly he'd been betrayed before, and still chose to spy on him? The waves were back. They were crashing over and over again as anger rose in his gut once more. And Techno! Fuck! I really thought... I don't know. Maybe this was stupid, but I thought he really cared. Tommy whimpered, shoving his forehead against Wilbur's shoulder. That made Wilbur pause. Rambu was one situation. He'd never befriended them on his own volition. Hold on, I need to look at something. Okay, where was I? Rambu was one situation. He'd never befriended them of his own volition. He was a spy doing what he was told, to to the point where he begged Techno to let him keep doing his job. While he could have some genuine care for Tommy inside of him, nothing about their friendship had ever been real. But Techno and Phil, Wilbur didn't know what to think about them. Techno had mentioned that Rambu reported to both him and Phil, which meant Phil was fully aware of what Rambu was doing. But up until very recently, Wilbur had divulged very little to Rambu, meaning that even if Rambu had been reporting their conversations to Phil, he wouldn't have gotten very much from them anyway. Besides, Wilbur had known Phil and Techno were getting reports on the two of them from people around the palace. Jack had outright admitted that he was supposed to be sending reports to Puffy, but told Wilbur he wasn't going to include anything more than vague information in them out of respect for him. Shit. Was that real? Or had that been a sophisticated ploy on Jack's end to make Wilbur trust him more? The waves grew louder as Wilbur struggled to take in a breath. Had everything been fake? His relationship with Jack? His relationship with Phil? Wilbur had wanted to trust Phil. Phil offered to mentor him. Phil told him the way he'd been treated on Eldingvegger was wrong, and Wilbur had wanted to believe him. Was it real? Or was it all part of Phil's plot to get Wilbur to agree to join the Empire? Phil had always promised to be upfront with him, and up until now, he'd kept that promise. But now this revelation about Rambu had thrown everything into question. It was entirely possible all of that had been real, and that Phil simply wanted to get extra information from Rambu to know where Wilbur's head was at. But this was politics. No matter what Wilbur thought their personal relationship was, he was still part of a planet that Phil wanted to claim for his empire. Getting close to Wilbur was beneficial for the deal, especially because of the influence he had over Tommy. And that was only made easier by having a spy who could tell him exactly what his relationship with Tommy was like at any given moment. The rest of the night was a haze. Wilbur eventually dragged Tommy back to his bed, and they fell into a fitful sleep curled around each other, just like they were little kids again. Just like they were in the playroom, being hunted again. When light crept in through the curtains, Wilbur was already awake. His head was pounding, and his chest ached fiercely from all the tears and heartbreak of the night before. Tommy had been tossing and turning all night, and the blankets on the bed were twisted into a strange ball that barely covered either of their legs. His head was pillowed on Tommy's stomach, and despite not being able to see his face, he could tell Tommy was also awake. He was playing with Wilbur's hair, like he needed something to occupy his hands to keep his nerves at bay. The tugging was surprisingly soothing for Wilbur's headache. They sat there for several long minutes in silence. The light in the room got brighter, and Wilbur could hear the palace coming to life right outside his door. By the time he and Tommy rolled out of bed, Jack would already be outside, waiting for Wilbur to get up so he could take him to breakfast. But that meant Jack would see that Tommy spent the night in Wilbur's room, and they would have to explain that they'd fully made up. And from there, they'd have to tell Phil and Techno they'd reconciled about their fight as well, after their fight as well, and there'd be no more barriers to them continuing their negotiations. Right now, Wilbur didn't want to move forward with the negotiations. Not when he and Tommy were both still reeling over their revelation about Rambu, and all the implications that could have. Will, Tommy whispered suddenly, his hands stilling. Are you awake? Wilbur hummed, not looking up from where his eyes were fixed on the ceiling. Yeah, I am. A beat passed between them. What are we gonna do? Tommy then asked, moving his hand away from Wilbur's head. I'm not sure, Wilbur confessed, focusing on the slow rise and fall of Tommy's abdomen under his head. When Phil and Techno find out we're talking again, they're gonna want to resume negotiations. Tommy made a worried noise. You don't think we can ask for more time? I don't know about you, but Techno's been on my ass reminding me that we can't put off the negotiations forever, Wilbur said, watching the way the canopy above his head shimmered in the morning light. He said they can push things off while we work out our argument, but without that standing in the way. Shit, Tommy muttered. Yeah, he basically said the same thing to me too. Another pause. I just don't know what I want to do, Tommy then said, dragging a hand down his face. I've been talking to Techno about potential contracts we draw up if LD Vega joins the Empire and all that shit, and just... it didn't seem bad. He took a shaky breath. It seemed like he was actually being fair, Tommy said, his voice cracking. Like he wasn't trying to trick me or fuck me over with the deal. His breathing hitched, and Wilbur winced as he listened to it rattle through Tommy's chest. I can't trust him, can I? The answer should have been easy. Wilbur should have been able to tell Tommy no. No, he couldn't trust Techno. No, he couldn't trust anyone in the palace. Neither of them could. But Wilbur thought back to Phil. He thought back to the soft way he would say little bird and the sensation of dark wings wrapping around him, keeping him safe. And Wilbur wasn't sure. Sorry, I needed a bit of a drink break. I don't know, he admitted, his voice raspy. Beneath him, Tommy stiffened. You don't know? Squeezing his eyes shut, Wilbur rolled over, burying his face into Tommy's shirt. I don't know what to think anymore. Seconds ticked by, one after the other. The light grew brighter in the room, and Wilbur knew they were running out of time. I feel like I'm back there, Tommy then said, his voice barely audible. Back in that fucking crawl space hiding behind you, thinking that at any moment we're gonna get dragged out and killed. Wilbur clenched his jaw. The same dread had been consuming him ever since he woke up. The feeling of something horrible looming right over their heads. That once they opened those doors, they could never go back. I don't think they'd kill us, Wilbur tried instead. Even if they were lying about everything else, there'd be no reason for them to keep us alive this long if they just wanted to execute us in the end. I know that, Tommy quickly told him, but, it's kind of an execution anyway, when you think about it. If we go out those doors and sign away our planet, there's no going back. All our power is in their hands. We're fucked, and there'll be no way out. Maybe, Wilbur acquiesced, but again, it doesn't make sense why they'd go to all this trouble if they were just going to fuck us over in the end anyway. I fucking know, Tommy cut himself off with a groan, pressing the heels of his palms into his eyes. What do we even do if we don't want to join? It's not like we can just... Tommy trailed off into silence, Wilbur waited a few moments for him to continue, and when he didn't, he finally glanced up at his face to see his little brother staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, like a light bulb had just gone off in his head. What if we left? What? Left? To go where? Wilbur asked, shifting off of Tommy so he could sit up properly. Away. Off of Zephyr's 4, Tommy said, brows furrowed now as his eyes darted around the room. We're fucking trapped here, Will. Don't you see? We literally have no other option but to join because we can't leave the planet unless we sign over Eldingvega. But what if we left and went somewhere else? Tommy, we came here because this is the only place that could protect us from a Sempi, Wilbur reminded him. If we leave, Dream will hunt us down and kill us. But what if we went somewhere else for protection? Tommy tried, talking faster now. Like Foslium, or the Badlands. We don't have to totally cross out joining the Empire, but we can just, I don't know, get some space away from Phil and Techno so we can actually work out what the fuck we want to do about all these goddamn eyes on us. Without all these goddamn eyes on us. Tommy's words were starting to spill into each other the longer he spoke. His eyes were wild, fingers twisting into the blanket of his lap tightly enough to turn his skin purple. He was nervous. That much was clear. And his anxiety seemed to be rubbing off on Wilbur, because the longer he spoke, the louder the waves got in his ears again. You're saying you want to just leave temporarily? Wilbur asked, struggling to understand. I don't know, Tommy stammered out. I don't fucking know anymore. But I feel like I can't breathe here. We don't know how much Phil and Techno were lying to us, so we can't trust them right now. And I definitely can't trust Rambo at all anymore. He paused then, letting out a bitter scoff. You know what the funny thing is? Wilbur frowned. What? Even though Tubbo nearly got us killed, I actually feel like what Rambo did was worse, he said, pulling his knees up to his chest. At least Tubbo was genuinely my friend for a while. Rambo never cared about me at all. His voice broke at the end of that, and he squeezed his eyes shut, taking another breath to steady himself. The small sounds of pain were like daggers straight to Wilbur's heart, because Tommy just sounded so resigned. Resigned in a way where it didn't even sound like his little brother's voice coming out of his mouth. Before Wilbur could linger too much on that, though, Tommy was speaking again. But if we stay, we have to go through with the negotiations, and I don't think I'm ready for that. I need time to think. We need to be really careful deciding if we want to leave or not, because I don't think that's going to be as easy as us just saying, hey, thanks for letting us stay here for a while, but we're going to head out now, Wilbur pointed out. Okay, so we need more time either way, Tommy nodded, the crease forming between his brows. He considered this for a moment, still twisting his fingers into the blanket. Then, another light bulb went off above his head. Let's not tell them we made up. Oh. It was such a simple solution, but it was strange to hear it coming out of Tommy's mouth. While his brother was certainly one for mischief and pranks, true deception wasn't in his nature. He was impulsive and often said exactly what was on his mind. Lying wasn't something he'd ever been good at. And yet here he was, suggesting that they outright lie to Phil and Techno. In a way, it was almost like Wilbur was watching a stranger talk. A stranger that had possessed his little brother's body. A stranger that was nervous, who curled his shoulders in and darted his eyes around like he was searching for a threat. A stranger that kept reaching for Wilbur's hands but pulled back at the last minute, like he was going to float away if he didn't find an anchor, but was too afraid to ask for it. "Jack's probably outside the door already," Wilbur said, reaching for Tommy's hand this time when he made another aborted move towards him. "You spent the night in my room. How are we going to explain that?" A small bit of tension leaked from Tommy's shoulders at the gesture, and he squeezed Wilbur's fingers. I'll say I woke up early and couldn't go back to sleep, so I came over here to try to talk to you, but we got in another argument," Tommy explained, eyes still darting between Wilbur's face and the door. "We'll yell at each other and shit so Jack can overhear. Then I'll leave, and I'll see if I can talk to..." He winced. "Trambu and Techno. See what they're both like. And if I could pick up on either of their bullshit. You talk to Phil and try to see where his head's at, and then we'll meet up again tonight and see what we want to do." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Wilbur asked. "Will you be okay talking to Techno and Rambo both on your own?" At this, Tommy clenched his jaw and dropped his eyes to his lap. "I'll be fine. Just gotta remember not to fall for their lies anymore." And a part of Wilbur wanted to agree, because that's what he'd been preaching this entire time. That Techno and Rambo were filling Tommy's head with lies. He should have been celebrating that his little brother had finally come around to his side. Yet, his chest felt hollow. Because not only was this so unlike his Tommy, but Wilbur still wasn't sure if it had all been lies. There was no more gut instinct to guide him here. That part of himself was silent as a war was waged inside himself. His head was telling him Tommy was right. That he needed to assume that everything Phil had told him up until this point was a lie meant to manipulate him, and that they had to get out before his judgment could be clouded even more than it already was. But his heart, that was saying something else. Only the day before, he had to stop himself from accepting Phil's offer right then and there. Now, he was debating whether he and Tommy could even stay on Zephyr's 4 at all. Tommy was right. They needed time to figure this out. "Okay," Wilbur breathed, glancing down at the blankets around his legs. "Let's stage a fight." There was a beat of silence as Tommy stared at him. A small, bitter smile hinted at in the corner of his lips. Then, he took a deep breath and let go of Wilbur's hands to climb off the bed. "How many times do I have to tell you not to call me Theseus?" Tommy shouted as soon as he was on his feet, turning his head towards the door. Wow, okay. They were jumping right into it then. "You brought this on yourself!" Wilbur shouted in return, also standing up so they were face to face. "Oh, because I betrayed you?" Tommy asked mockingly, inching towards the door. "Says the one sleeping in the Emperor's wing of the palace, wearing a fucking fancy coat and cozying up with him like you two are best friends." Why is my Tommy accent going to shit? What the fuck? Despite the fact that Wilbur knew this was a fake fight, there were still grains of truth in what Tommy was saying. Things they hadn't gotten the chance to properly address. It wasn't difficult to hear that in Tommy's anger, and all Wilbur could do was try his best not to flinch at it. "What? Are you jealous? Why don't you go run and tell Technoblade about all about how cruel I'm being? It wouldn't be the first time you've bitched to him about me, he yelled back. At this, Tommy winced, and Wilbur clenched his jaw. I'm sorry, he quickly whispered, glancing at the door to the bedroom. I didn't mean... It's okay, Tommy whispered back, smoothing out his expression as he took a step towards Wilbur. You're doing good. He took another deep breath and glanced at the door again. Then stop giving me so much to bitch about. There we go. They were right in front of the door to the bedroom now. If Jack was outside, there was no way he wouldn't at least be able to hear their muffled shouts. You call it bitching? I call it learning how to act like a fucking adult, Wilbur shot back. When Tommy winced again, pain radiated through Wilbur's chest. He closed the gap between them, wrapping Tommy in a quick hug and ducking down to whisper in his ear. I swear, I'm just saying this to... It's okay. Tommy reassured him again. I'll come back here tonight and we can figure things out. Does that sound good? Wilbur nodded. Yes, that's fine. Okay. And I'm sorry for this. Then, before Wilbur could ask what Tommy meant by that, his little brother was shoving him back with such violent force, he almost lost his footing. He barely managed to catch himself as he stumbled back, his shoulders stinging where Tommy had slammed his hands into them. Get the fuck away from me! Tommy screamed loud enough that his words felt like a literal slap to the face. As soon as the words left his mouth, though, his twisted scowl disappeared again, and he gave Wilbur a small nod. And with that, he turned on his heel and stormed towards the door, not looking back again as he ran out and down the hallway. Wilbur's chest stung, and the shock on his face felt like anything but an act as he stumbled out of his room after Tommy. He watched Tommy practically run down the hall, and although it felt like such an eerie parallel to the night before, this time Wilbur had to remind himself to stay rooted in place and not go after him. Tommy turned the corner, and just like that, he was gone. Hold on, gotta check something. Okay. Just like that, it was as if the night before had never happened. The truth only existed in both his and Tommy's memories. Wilbur was frozen for a few moments, staring at the spot where Tommy had disappeared around the corner of the hall. He knew it was an act. He knew this. But fuck. It still hurt to hear Tommy's anger and know that just the night before, it had been completely genuine. Suddenly, a voice startled Wilbur out of his shock. What the fuck was that? Wait, hold on. What the fuck was that? Turning, Wilbur saw Jack standing in his usual spot right across from his door. His brows were furrowed, and he was glancing between Wilbur and the hall where Tommy had disappeared. Isn't it self-explanatory? Wilbur scoffed, trying to sound as tired as possible in the hopes that it would make the lie sound more genuine. No, it's not, Jack said, taking a step towards Wilbur. Are you okay? Why was Theseus in your room? Wilbur couldn't tell if the concern in Jack's voice was real or not. He focused on the guard's face, searching for any hint of deception in his mismatched eyes. If anything, though, that only made Wilbur's worry worse, because there were no alarm bells ringing in his head. Jack seemed genuine, but Wilbur had no idea if he could trust his own judgment or not. He came by here really early this morning, Wilbur explained, dragging a hand down his face so he could avoid meeting Jack's eyes. He wanted us to talk, wanted us to try and make up. But obviously that didn't fucking work. Jack frowned, looking back down the hall again with a crease between his brows. Are you sure you're okay, Will? No, are you sure you're okay, Will? He asked, quieter this time. Guilt wormed its way up Wilbur's throat, threatening to choke him as he listened to the worry dripping from Jack's words. I'm fine, Wilbur lied, turning to head back to his room. I'm gonna go get dressed, and then we can go to breakfast. He let the door to his room hiss shut behind him before he could hear Jack's reply. A few minutes later, Wilbur found himself having slipped back into his routine like he'd never left it. He walked down the hall of the personal wing, Jack right at his heels as they made their way towards the dining room for breakfast. His boots clicked against the marble floor, and his coat brushed against his calves with every step. It was almost too easy for Wilbur to pretend that the night before hadn't happened, that he and Tommy were still fighting, and that he was oblivious to the lies he was being wrapped in by the people around him. You see, here's what I'm thinking, though. Jack has been Wilbur's guard for months. Surely he'd pick up on the fact that if there was actually an argument between him and Tommy, that Wilbur would want to stay in his room for breakfast. Something. Jack has to know something at this point. There's no way. Jack kept frowning at him, and Wilbur couldn't tell if it was because he was worried or because he hadn't told Jack the details of his fight with Tommy. If Jack was a spy like Rambo, wouldn't he be trying to push to find out what they talked about? But then again, Jack had never been the type to push for information. Wilbur had offered it up freely. Was that all part of Jack's design? Or did he genuinely just want to be there for Wilbur if he needed it? He didn't know. Right when he thought he'd been getting a grip on his life in the palace, the waves rose up again, and he was left to flail helplessly against the turbulent waves. They made it to the dining room. He stood outside the archway, counting his breaths in his head as he tried to prepare himself for the conversation that awaited him. Because Phil was sitting at that table. Phil, who only yesterday had told Wilbur he deserved better, and made Wilbur want to believe him. And a part of Wilbur still wanted to, but he knew he couldn't. Not right now. His paranoia was back in full force. A prickling under his skin he'd finally managed to put to rest, and now it had returned stronger than ever. Wilbur felt like all eyes were on him as he forced himself to step into the dining room, and he had to fight not to hunch his shoulders under their knowing gazes. "Morning, mate." Phil's voice echoed in the dining room, and Wilbur suppressed a flinch as he sat down in his usual spot next to Phil at the table. "Morning, Phil," Wilbur murmured, keeping his eyes on the table as a servant set his breakfast plate in front of him. Even without looking up to see his face, Wilbur could feel Phil's mood shift. "Is everything all right?" Phil asked, setting down his fork. No, Wilbur wasn't all right. So many questions sat on the tip of his tongue, straining to slip out so Wilbur could beg for the answers he was so desperate for. What is this? Is this just part of your game? Do you care about me? Could you ever care about me? He swallowed down the words with a sip of his water. Theseus visited my room this morning, Wilbur said instead, forcing himself to use Tommy's formal name again. He wanted to try and resolve things, but we got into another argument instead. Oh. There was a beat of silence as Phil considered this, and Wilbur kept his eyes on his plate, knowing Phil would take any sign of nervousness as just him being upset about Tommy. Was it similar to what you argued about during the negotiations? Phil then asked, folding his hands in front of him. Wilbur shrugged. Pretty much. You know how we've been. It was better to keep it vague. It wasn't unreasonable to assume Wilbur wouldn't want to talk about it, so he was going to rely on that right now. If he went into too much detail, he risked contradicting himself. Phil could fill in the blanks himself. Another minute passed in silence. Phil lifted his hand, resting it on the back of Wilbur's neck and giving it a reassuring squeeze. Wilbur couldn't stop himself from leaning into the touch, the guilt twisting his insides again as he tried and failed at reminding himself that this could all be an act. You'll work things out soon, Phil told him softly. Soon this will all be behind you two, and you'll probably look back and laugh at how stubborn you both were. Yes, they were both stubborn, but there'd been no laughter the night before. If anything, Wilbur's eyes still burned from all the tears he shed into Tommy's shirt. It was a miracle they weren't bright red this morning. I'm still thinking about your offer, Wilbur said suddenly, desperate to change the subject from the fight he had with Tommy. Phil blinked. Is that so? Wilbur nodded, head drooping slightly when Phil began to rub small circles into the back of his neck again. Yeah, just thinking about it. That's fine. I want you to take your time with it, Phil reassured him. You'll have plenty of time to think it over once the negotiations are settled. And that made Wilbur stiffen. The hand on the back of his neck was no longer a comfort, but a threat. A reminder that at any second, Phil could wrap that hand around his throat and choke him. That despite the choice Phil was presenting to him, there was no real choice for him and Tommy. Phil assumed that when the negotiations were over, they'll have joined the Empire. And at this point, they were in a position where they really didn't have another option. At least, not while they were on Zephyr's 4. Not while Wilbur was, quite literally, under Phil's thumb. Gritting his teeth, he straightened up in his seat, relieved when Phil pulled his hand back. Yes, I'm sure we will, Wilbur forced out, picking up his fork to start eating his breakfast as his heart pounded in his chest. Thankfully, Phil didn't seem to notice the tension lining Wilbur's shoulders as he also turned back to his meal. The rest of breakfast passed by in a blur. Wilbur found himself watching Phil whenever the man's head was turned the other way. His eyes lingered on the lines of Phil's face, or the way his wings rustled every few minutes like clockwork. Was that a smirk playing on the corners of his lips, or was it just Wilbur's imagination? Was there a knowing glint in Phil's icy eyes, or was that just the reflection of the lights above their heads? When Phil smiled at him, was it just because he was enjoying breakfast with him? Or was it because he knew he had the upper hand? Wilbur remembered that Phil had once mentioned how an elytrian might tuck their wings into their back to hide their emotions. But how could they also learn to not let their wings give away their thoughts so easily? But how they could also learn how to not let their wings give away their thoughts so easily. The black wings brushing against the floor were not tucked into Phil's back. They were relaxed, dark feathers glimmering like the night sky itself. At one point, Phil's eyes flickered to Wilbur again, and he had to pretend he'd been staring at his plate the entire time. But from his peripheral vision, he could see his wings reaching out, almost as if they were trying to stretch towards Wilbur. But then, the stretching stopped, and they returned back to their normal positions. His head was starting to hurt from theorizing about every little move Phil made. During the rest of the meal, Phil tried to talk to Wilbur some more about random, inconsequential things, weather patterns and new books, but gave up when it became obvious that he wasn't in the right headspace to hold a conversation. Instead, they finished their food in silence. A silence that was probably comfortable to Phil, but weighed down Wilbur's shoulders and wrapped around his throat like an invisible albatross. Relief washed over Wilbur when he saw that Phil's plate was empty. He watched Phil push to his feet, wings rustling with the movement as he glanced between Wilbur and the archway leading out of the dining room. If you need to come talk, you know where I am, Phil said gently, hand grazing over Wilbur's back as he passed by his chair. The warmth was fleeting. It was there for a split second, and then it was gone just as quickly. Phil's footsteps faded as he left the dining room. Wilbur waited several minutes before looking up from his plate, finding himself alone at a table with no evidence that Phil had ever been there in the first place. His plate had been cleaned up the minute he'd left, and the table suddenly felt too large to be sitting alone at. The guard's eyes lingered on his back as he stood up from his chair, despite the fact that his plate was still half full. His skin was still prickling. A dark part of his mind wondered if peeling it off would finally make it go away. How has it already been an hour? I'm sorry? What? Wandering out of the dining room, Wilbur found himself at a loss for what to do. He needed to think over their options, but how was he supposed to do that with so many eyes on him? Even if he went to his room, he knew the prickling would still be there. The paranoia had settled itself so deeply in his bones, it was setting all his nerve endings on fire. What a strange contrast, to feel as though he was being doused with salt water and burning at the same time. The waves were endless as they trapped him in their push and pull. In a way, he'd grown numb to the maelstrom. After so long, it was overwhelming to be right. Especially when all Wilbur could think was how badly he wished he'd been wrong. Wilbur didn't speak much to Jack that day. In fact, he didn't speak much to anyone. He tried to hide away in the library and bury his anxieties in books, but he could barely focus enough to read a single page. Questions circled his mind like vultures looking for carton. Or carry-on, sorry. I took my glasses off because I, need to clean them. And or is it carry-in? I don't know if it's carry-on or carry-in. I'm gonna take a moment to clean my glasses. I could see a speck when I was looking at the screen, and it bothered me. There we go. But there was still no answers to be found. Late in the afternoon, Wilbur left the library. He'd spent most of his time staring at the wall, mulling over their options in his head. When it became clear that he was just repeating the same points over and over to himself, though, he gave up, accepting that he wasn't going to get any further until he got a chance to speak to Tommy again. Jack led him out of the library, back towards the personal wing. But before the doors were even in sight, Wilbur found himself running into possibly the last person he wanted to see today. "Oh, Orpheus, I was looking for you," Rambu said, rushing towards him as soon as he and Jack rounded the corner. Clenching his jaw, Wilbur schooled his face into a mask of neutrality. What for? He was surprised by how level his voice was. Just seeing Rambu's face was enough to send the waves crashing again, especially as he thought back to Tommy's tears from the night before. "I just wanted to see if you talked to Tommy this morning," Rambu explained, jolting Wilbur in surprise. Did he know that he and Tommy made up? How could he know? No one was around when Tommy went to Wilbur's room the night before. The hallway had been empty, and if Rambu somehow had been around, then he would have reported their reconciliation to Phil. Right? Fuck. Maybe Phil and Techno both knew that he and Tommy had made up, but weren't telling them that they knew. Maybe they wanted to see how long he and Tommy would lie to them. Maybe this was all a test. Maybe... No. Why? Wilbur forced out before his thoughts could spiral into complete disarray. Hold on a minute. He said no to Rambu asking if he talked to Tommy this morning. Jack's gonna know something's up. Rambu furrowed his brows, eyes dropping to the floor. Shoot, I figured you hadn't, but I was just wondering because I think he's mad at me. Wilbur's spinning thoughts began to slow. Why do you think he's mad at you? Wilbur asked, folding his arms behind his back. I don't know. I don't remember doing anything to upset him, but... Rambu bit his lip, dual-toned hands twisting in front of him. He didn't come to breakfast this morning, so I got worried and went to check on him, but he just didn't seem to want to talk to me. Like, he kept snapping at me and I just don't know what I did wrong. Oh, thank fuck. That made a lot more sense. Of course Rambu was going to pick up on Tommy's sudden coldness to him. It was part of his job to be attuned to both his and Wilbur's moods, after all. Now, Wilbur had a choice. While he was tempted to pretend to be completely oblivious, Jack and Phil both knew about his and Tommy's most recent fight. From what he could tell, Rambu hadn't been told about this yet, but the information would get to him sooner or later. If he learned about it after this conversation, he'd wonder why Wilbur didn't bring it up. Rambu would probably assume it was because Wilbur had stopped trusting him again. The night before, he told Techno he thought he was getting through to Wilbur. That meant that right now, Wilbur had the upper hand. He didn't trust Rambu, but Rambu thought he did. This was an opportunity Wilbur couldn't waste. That's unfortunate, Wilbur said, making sure to be careful with his words. That might actually have something to do with me, because I technically did talk to him this morning, but it was early, he explained, shoving his hands in his pockets. You did? Rambu frowned. Wilbur nodded. He couldn't sleep, so he came to my room early this morning to try and talk things out, but, we just ended up getting into another argument. Understanding dawned over Rambu's face. Oh, that makes sense. Oh yeah, Wilbur was sure it did. What did you guys fight about? He asked after another moment. Now that Wilbur knew the reason behind Rambu's nosiness, he couldn't help but almost be awed by how bad he was at being subtle. Maybe that was an advantage. Despite how blatantly Rambu pushed for information, Wilbur had actually started to let his guard down around him. He convinced himself that Rambu was just socially awkward, because a spy wouldn't be as obvious as he was. And that's what worked to Rambu's favor. He was so blatant about digging for information, it almost seemed ridiculous to think there could be nefarious intent behind it. It sickened Wilbur to think about that now. Just the same shit Tommy was pissed about before, with me staying in the personal wing and all. Wilbur lied, twisting his fingers into the lining of his coat pockets. He thinks I'm a hypocrite. Rambu considered this for a moment, still wringing his hands together as his hair fell over his eyes. Can I ask you something personal, Orpheus? Wilbur had to resist the urge to roll his eyes. I can't promise I'll answer, but sure. How did you get so close with Phil? He asked, blinking fast as he kept his eyes fixed on Wilbur's chin. It seemed like a switch flipped one day, and suddenly you were with Phil all the time. Oh, that was a good one. If Rambu had asked this yesterday, if he had asked this before Wilbur knew the truth of his intentions, he probably would have choked at a question like this. Because Wilbur still wasn't sure exactly how the shift between him and Phil happened. One day, all of their interactions had revolved around veiled threats and complex word games that kept him in a near constant state of anxiety. Then something flipped, and Wilbur found himself seeking Phil out any time he needed someone to talk to. He craved Phil's guidance, and wanted to believe the promises hidden beneath his words, or between his words. That he saw Wilbur as more than just an opportunity. That when he told Wilbur he had potential for greatness, he meant it. Wilbur had gone from analyzing every word that came out of Phil's mouth for signs of a lie, to wanting to believe even the most inane truths. Truths that didn't make sense. Truths that couldn't be truths. But Wilbur convinced himself were possible anyway. An unsaid truth that was twisted into the meaning of the nickname Little Bird. A truth that was folded between the lines of Phil telling Wilbur he deserved better, and that he wanted to help him become something more. But it wasn't yesterday. The night before hadn't been a paranoia-induced hallucination. It had been real. The worry in Rambu's eyes was fake. The way he curled in on himself when he asked why Tommy might be upset with him was part of an act. Liar. Wilbur's mind whispered the longer he stared at Rambu. Liar, liar, liar. It took time, Wilbur answered, straightening his shoulders as lies and truth combined spilled from his lips like water. I don't know exactly how it happened, but we just got to know each other, gradually. And one day I realized that I was no longer second-guessing every interaction we had. He paused. It was a calculated pause, one that Rambu would take as hesitation, although Wilbur already knew exactly what he was going to say next. One day I realized I no longer thought he was lying every time we spoke. Just like he expected, Rambu let out a soft gasp at that. His eyes widened, and nausea crept up the back of his throat, knowing that Rambu was going to run and repeat this conversation to Phil the second they said their goodbyes. I guess that makes sense. Rambu stammered, mind clearly reeling with the implications of what Wilbur had told him. He paused, glancing around the hall like he was searching for an escape. Thanks for, talking with me. I'll try to talk with Tommy again later tonight. If he's upset after his fight with you, I want to be there to help him if he needs, Rambu said, taking a step back from Wilbur. I should be going, though. I just realized Techno's probably waiting to start our lessons. The anger was back. It was surging through Wilbur's chest, echoing in the waves that crashed in his head as he stared at the traitor standing in front of him. But he pressed his lips together and forced himself to nod. Thank you, Rambu. It eases my mind a bit knowing that even if we're not talking, Tommy has a friend like you to rely on. A part of him wanted to see Rambu flinch, to watch a piece of the facade break off. Any acknowledgement that Rambu knew how badly he was hurting Tommy with his act. He didn't even blink. That means a lot, Orpheus, he said instead, giving Wilbur a small smile. Thank you. Of course, Wilbur replied, flashing Rambu a sickly sweet smile in return. With one last nod, Rambu turned on his heel and hurried back the way he came. And Wilbur didn't miss how it was straight in the direction of the throne room. That night, Wilbur took dinner in his room. This wasn't unusual for him, although it had become more commonplace to share meals with Phil the longer he stayed in the personal wing. He still took meals alone several times a week. It was usually when he was too drained to even think about holding a conversation with Phil, when all he wanted was to bury himself in his blankets and let his mind go blank until the next morning came. Today was different, but Phil didn't know that, so no one batted an eye at his request to eat alone. Chewing on a bread roll, he paced around his bedroom, lost in thought as he tried to think of what happened now. Tommy had promised he would come by his room again tonight, but he hadn't said what time, so that left Wilbur with a seemingly endless wait stretched in front of him, and far too many thoughts to sort through on his own. His conversation with Rambu hadn't just left a bad taste in his mouth, it nearly made him sick. How easily Rambu could pretend to care. How there hadn't been the slightest hint of guilt in that smile he flashed Wilbur at the end. Tommy was right. They were suffocating here. He could still feel the phantom weight of Phil's hand on the back of his neck, that unsaid promise echoing in his ears. The negotiations were practically finished. The decision had been made, and all that was left was for Tommy to sign the papers. The illusion of choice was still being dangled in front of them, but the truth of the matter was that he and Tommy were shackled here. Hands on shoulders, gazes pressing down on them. The option to refuse was taken from them long ago. They were merely being led through a whole song and dance without even being able to hear the music. With the information Rambu provided them, Phil and Techno were able to corral Wilbur and Tommy like mindless cattle. Maybe that wasn't true, but Wilbur couldn't afford to rely on maybes anymore. They could only keep up the act of their argument for so long before one of them slipped up, and then they would be out of time. Late into the evening, long after his mostly empty plate had been taken from his room, Wilbur heard a knock at his door. His heart leapt in his throat as he ran to the door. When it hissed open to reveal his little brother on the other side, a colossal weight was lifted off his shoulders, and it took all his energy not to collapse on Tommy as he dragged him inside. Thank fuck, I was going nuts on my own, Wilbur whispered as he yanked Tommy into a hug. Tommy hugged back just as tight, burying his face in Wilbur's shoulder and clutching the back of his shirt like a drowning man. Me too. I didn't want to risk anyone spotting me, so I waited as long as I could. But I felt like my head was going to explode if I didn't talk to you soon. For the first time since Tommy left that morning, the prickling under his skin eased up. It wasn't gone completely, but he no longer felt like his nerves were on fire, and the relief of that alone was enough to make him go weak in the knees. The two stayed like that for a few more minutes. The only sound in the room was their ragged breaths, and Wilbur could feel Tommy's rapid heartbeat fluttering against his shirt. Eventually, Wilbur forced himself to pull back. Tommy didn't fight it, but before he could say anything, Wilbur was nudging his shoulder, guiding him to the couch in the center of the room. They sat down together, pressed shoulder to shoulder as silence filled the air between them. There was so much they needed to talk about. Too much. Too many thoughts and feelings put into words. But they were on limited time, so they had to try. I talked to Phil and Rombu today, Wilbur began, staring at his hands in his lap. Rombu mentioned you seemed upset at him. Sighing, Tommy nodded. Yeah, I tried to act like everything was normal. I could barely stand to look at him, you know? Every time I saw his face, I'd just think about what he said last night. I'd get so upset He cut himself off with a shaky breath. Wilbur waited, giving him time to collect himself. I managed to talk to him a bit during dinner. He said you told him about our fight, so I just played off of that, Tommy explained, picking at the skin around his nails. I don't think he suspects anything. That's good, Wilbur murmured, biting the inside of his cheek. Did you talk to Techno? At this, Tommy flinched, curling further back into the couch. Yeah, I did. He paused, a crease forming between his brows. It was easier than talking to Rambo, but harder at the same time. Because at least with Rambo, I know it's all fake, and know he never gave a shit. But with Techno, it's... His hands fluttered in the air as he struggled to put his thoughts into words. But truthfully, he didn't need to. Wilbur understood exactly what he was trying to say. I get it, he said, bringing his knees up to his chest. I feel the same about Phil. They fell into silence again. Understanding wasn't the same as having answers, and that was what they needed most at the moment. Phil said something to me today. Wilbur piped up after a few minutes of staring at the wall. I think he meant it in, a comforting way, but it wasn't. Tommy frowned, turning to look at Wilbur. What did he say? Wilbur squeezed his eyes shut. Sorry, I just had to yawn real quick. And stretch. I'm stretching. Wilbur squeezed his eyes shut, ignoring the phantom hand tracing circles into the back of his neck. He's really confident we're joining the Empire. While he didn't say it outright, he said something that implied it's basically been decided. Fuck, Tommy muttered, wrapping his arms around himself. That's... fuck. I know, Wilbur huffed, gaze fixing on the wall again. Another beat. He's not wrong, Tommy then said. It's far softer this time. I've talked with Techno about it so much. I've I've done everything but sign the fucking paper. It's my fault. Immediately, Wilbur shook his head. It's not your fault. It is, Tommy insisted, voice cracking. I'm the one who opened up to Techno and Rambo first. I'm the one who pushed for us to consider joining the Empire. You kept telling me we couldn't trust anyone, but I thought you were just being paranoid. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking in a way that made Wilbur's chest ache. I feel so fucking stupid, he then said, sounding like he was on the verge of breaking down. Reaching out, Wilbur pulled Tommy into his side, and Tommy immediately curled against his chest. I can't breathe here, Wilbur, Tommy stammered, struggling to hold back tears. I can't fucking think with Techno and Rambo breathing down my goddamn neck, and it's driving me insane. Burying his face in Tommy's hair, Wilbur took a deep breath, trying to ignore the anxiety wrapping a band around his chest. Me too, he confessed. I thought talking to Phil might help clear things up, but it only made things worse. I feel like I'm being watched and my thoughts just start spinning out of control. You feel like you're going to scream if you don't get out soon? Tommy finished for him, clutching the front of his shirt like a child. Yeah, I get it. Seconds ticked by. The iron band got tighter. We can't stay here, Tommy finally said, his voice barely audible in the dark room. Wilbur swallowed down the lump in his throat. I think you're right. A breath. It's not shutting down the negotiations, Tommy continued, a bit louder now. We need more time, and we need to just get some time away from Techno and Phil. They'll never go for that, Wilbur pointed out. It's way too dangerous with the SMP looking for us, and Phil and Techno have made it clear they don't want a SMP to get their hands on us. Yeah, which means we have to escape. A rock dropped into Wilbur's gut. He'd known that's where this conversation was going since the moment Tommy walked into the room. But it was one thing to think about escape as an abstract idea. It was a whole other thing to actually consider it as a possibility. He tried to imagine leaving Zephyrus 4, flying out into space again, trying to find a new planet to hide out on while ignoring the twinge of regret that was already festering inside of him. A part of him wanted to keep trying, to get more information, try to figure out what had been a lie and what was real. But that would take time that they didn't have. Plain and simple. It's not going to be easy, Wilbur then said. This place is a fortress. We're not going to be able to just walk out the front door. At this, Tommy pulled away from the hug, forcing Wilbur to meet his eyes. They were bloodshot, and tears still threatened to spill over onto his cheeks. But there was a determination settled into the watery blue that Wilbur had never seen before. We shouldn't have been able to escape Eldingvega. Here we are, Tommy reminded him, wrapping his arms around himself again. So how hard can it be? Let's see. Might take a bit more time for the next chapter to come out because it's going to be very long. Either it'll be very long or I'm going to split into 2 chapters once I'm done with the entire thing. We'll see how I feel once it's written, but goddamn, it's going to be a doozy. So that chapter 28 So that 28 chapter count might end up shifting to 29. Okay. God, I really hope that they come to their senses and realize that they do care. And that they all just stay and be a happy family. I want that. I don't want them to leave. This is an emotional roller coaster, Jesus Christ. Okay. Oh wait, did I miss Be Real? God damn it, 1 second. Posting a late one. Say cheese. There we go. Alright. I think that is going to be my stream. Oh! I think I know who we will raid. But first, let me do this. There we go. Oh, I never actually took off the starting soon screen. Oops. There we go. Let's raid Moo. She's playing Little Nightmares. An uncapped holiday subathon. Or is it Little Nightmares 2? It's one of the two. It's Little Nightmares 2. She's playing Little Nightmares 2. So yeah. Go show her some love. I'm not going to be streaming for the next couple days, and probably not the 26th either, because tomorrow's Christmas Eve, and then 2 days later is Christmas, and then on the 26th is my friend's birthday, and so I'm going to be celebrating with them. Probably be back on the 27th. We'll see if I'm busy that day or not. Probably won't be, but we'll see. The next stream is probably going to be something Minecraft. Like, ooh! I got onto a new, server today, so we could do some of that on the 27th. Alright. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, follow me on my other socials if you want. And I will see you next time. Bye!